Neil Oliver joins me now. Neil, what a fascinating story this has been. Does the appalling treatment of Novak Djokovic show just what a disaster Australia's COVID-0 approach has been?
Yes, it does. I think it's been very valuable, very important that someone as famous, as iconic as Novak Djokovic has been at the centre of a test case here. I think it shows up. It just exposes to a very bright light. Yes, the incompetence and the heavy-handedness of the Australian regulations. I think the Australian politicians, and they're not alone in this at all. It's happened in Australia, and so they have been exposed in this way. But it's shown that so many of the politicians around the world have lacked the stature to cope with the events that are unfolding around them, and even as it became demonstrable of the fact that they couldn't beat the virus. None of their restrictions, none of their regulations worked. And none of them had the class or the wit or the wisdom to take a different tack. They've just continued to stand at the roulette wheel and keep on gambling that their one option would finally win them back all the money that they had lost. And I think watching the Djokovic family, for example, they ran rings around the Australian authorities. They appeared dignified. All of them that I saw spoke eloquently, often in perfect English, and they just seemed to rise above it. And everything they said and everything they did seemed to further expose the Australian authorities for being the petty authoritarians that they demonstrably are. And I'm delighted that things have worked out for Djokovic as they have, although obviously there's still a sword of Damocles hanging over him. And I think that's another telling element, perhaps the most telling of all, that Djokovic, as we know, followed the law. He followed the letter of the law. He did all that was expected of him. That judge today tried to underline that. And the fact that the Australian government is still, retaining the right basically to overlook the law, it is so telling. I remember I was in Canberra filming in Australia in 2015 around the anniversary of Gallipoli. And in New Parliament House in Canberra, there's a copy of Magna Carta proudly on display. It's the only one in the Southern Hemisphere. Magna Carta is one of the foundation blocks of democracy, of modern liberal democracy, and the rights that we all hold so dear. And fundamentally, Magna Carta underscores the fact that no one is above the law. Not emperors, not kings, not politicians, not governments. No one is above the law. That is, and the fact that Australia has a copy of Magna Carta on display in New Parliament House would seem to suggest that they also agree with that. But their present cohort of politicians have just run roughshod over that. And this has been so exposing for them. It shows the ineptitude, the lack of professionalism, the incompetence, the pettiness, the hubris.
I completely agree, Neil. And the problem is, because of what Australians have been put through these past 2 years, they are angry. And unfortunately, it seems to have brought out quite an insular, inward-looking side to the Aussie psyche, which I never used to see, Neil, because obviously I have a lot of relatives in Australia and I've been there a lot. But what a lot of people don't realise is that Australians themselves have been treated in an inhumane way by their governments, both federally and on the state level, for the past 2 years. I mean, I've been researching, Neil, today some of the horrific stories, which are people being banned from cancer treatment because they happen to live 5 minutes across a state border. Fathers being banned from seeing their 4-year-old daughters dying of cancer in a Brisbane hospital because they would have to cross the state border. People being banned from their own mother and father's funerals. So the problem is, when the government treats its citizens in this way to try and control a virus, which obviously they failed to do, it feels like the Australian population now want to punish the outsiders, the plague rats, as some of them describe them, who are coming in on flights. And how do we break this cycle, Neil? Because it feels like the Australian population has been subjected to cruelty, but now they are they're putting that cruelty onto visitors, and that feels so wrong.
It does feel so wrong, Dan. Between 2013 and 2018, I spent in total 2 years or more in Australia. My whole family were out at one point with me. We were there for 6 months. My kids went to school in Coogee Primary in Sydney. We were there as a family a couple of times, 3 times, and I was there many, many more times than that. I love Australia, and I have dear friends in Australia that I'm in touch with to this day, and that I worry about, will I ever get the chance to go back and catch up with them face to face? And because of those contacts, I'm hearing firsthand from people who are, they're in contact with me verbally and via email, laying out, heartbreaking stories of their own, about how confused, how disbelieving they are, how they cannot believe what their country has become. So, the pain is there. And, you're quoting, some Australians, calling people plague rats and wanting to see all sorts of justice meted out against people like Novak Djokovic. But, as I'm sure you do, I know personally many Australians who are only saying that they want out of this nightmare. And that they themselves cannot believe what has unfolded there in the last couple of years. The inhumanity and the immorality of the regulations and the restrictions that have been imposed in Australia, across Europe, here, in Canada, in North America, it has been a very exposing. It's been a revelation to me. But I think I know, and I'm sure you do too, that the good heart of the people of Australia is still there. And I know that because I hear from all the people that I'm talking to want this to end. And they are not people, they're not talking about plague rats, and they're not wanting whatever, the hammer of the law or whatever brought down on visitors or on anybody else. Yes, you'll be hearing those voices or seeing them in the press and in the media, but it would be unfair and inaccurate to characterise the whole of Australia.
No, you're right.
That way.
You're right, because
Australia,
the establishment has tried to silence these voices. That's what it comes down to.
Australia is, you do become aware if you spend time there that in amongst that whole kind of familiar, sunburnt, barbecue, larrikin character that's advertised, it is also a very obedient and rule-obeying society as well. And it works because the state, previously is very efficient. The healthcare and the way things are done, and the way it works. Australia works, and because it worked and it delivered to the majority of the people what was needed and what was wanted, the people repaid that by going along with the rules. And I think that has laid them open and made them vulnerable to what has happened in the last couple of years, which is to say that this particular batch of politicians faced with COVID seem to have just run to the drawer marked emergency powers, and they've emptied it out onto the carpet, and they're just using everything they can find.
No, you're completely right.
The wrong way to go.
It's fascinating analysis, because I think Aussies, much more than Brits, tend to trust their governments. And of course, because their governments have put them through such hell to achieve zero COVID, which of course was always a fantasy. It was a futile fantasy, and it hasn't come true. There's a lot of people who are starting to question and lose faith in that trust. And that's why we end up with the politicians trying to crack down even harder on Djokovic, because it's a great distraction, isn't it, ahead of a federal election.
Just a final point. I think it's probably worth saying, Novak Djokovic, I'm not even a great sports follower, but even I, probably better than a sports fan, I can see that Novak Djokovic is something very, very special. Yeah. He's one of sports immortals, without a shadow of a doubt. and he's got where he's got by himself. You know, it's by his own will, and I'm sure he's got a great team around him. But it's the power of his will, his determination, and his talent that's got him to where he is. And he has been confronted by these Australian politicians, these here today, gone tomorrow people. And politicians are usually preoccupied with their legacy. You know, how they'll be remembered. Now, if Scott Morrison and the rest of them at the moment are remembered at all, it will be as footnotes in the story of Novak Djokovic, you know, because they have demonstrated that they have been dwarfed, utterly outpositioned and dwarfed by the times in which they have found themselves living and governing. And they'll only be remembered as incompetents who briefly inconvenienced one of sport's immortals in the form of Novak
one of the greats who stood up for liberty, and there haven't been many who have, and so we will not forget that. Neil Oliver, I have to say, I'm hearing all of these suggestions that the Melbourne fans might boo Novak Djokovic if he does make it to the Aussie Open, but you just know there are going to be tens of millions of us who, as you say, maybe not huge tennis fans in the past, I'm certainly not, but we are going to be rooting for Djokovic in a way that we never would have been before this tournament. But Neil
100%.
Oliver, thank you so much.